Spectral Splatter, from ghosts to gore and everything in between. Today, we're more on the splatter side of the spectrum. We're looking at a movie that many consider to be one of the most controversial, certainly one of the most hard-to-watch films ever made. We're talking about the 1980 film Cannibal Holocaust, directed by Ruggero Deodato.
4 young and fearless Americans, children of the space age, armed with cameras, microphones, and curiosity. Alan Yates, Faye Daniels, and their 2 cameramen and inseparable friends, Jack Anders and Mark Tomaso. 4 youngsters who never came back. Are they still alive? And if so, where are they? These are the questions that the rescue team sponsored by New York University and the Pan American Broadcasting System hope to be able to answer.
It is a film that we had trouble watching for many reasons. One, practically speaking, is how to figure out to turn the subtitles off. Spoiler alert, we weren't able to. So it's a film that's mostly in English, but is designed for an Italian audience, and therefore includes Italian subtitles.
So we did learn a little Italian through the course of the movie.
We learned a little Italian. I would argue that this film is mostly about what's seen rather than what's said on the screen, however. So this is my second time seeing the film, and I put it in my top 5 greatest horror films of all time.
Wow.
At number 5. A lot of heads shaking at this table.
And are you going to rethink that decision?
No, I'll try to defend it, I suppose. However, I said immediately after watching this that is the final time I'll ever watch this movie. It has many, many problems. It has many problems even in its most... even if we read it as trying to say kind of a classic message, like who are the real savages, right? There's something, I think, exploitative about that very move in its own right. But I had a lot of fun talking about this film the first time I saw it, and I know now, with a fresh perspective, some fresh blood in the room today, that there is certainly a lot to say about what is redeeming, right, and certainly about what is irredeemable in this film. I don't know, why don't we start with the reactions from my friend Josh here saw it for the first time, my friend Andrew is the son of a bitch who introduced me to the movie.
I've seen it 4 or 5 times, and we watched it on my DVD, so I'm the one to blame for this horrible
I've got a tall glass of vodka and Coke right now, mostly vodka. It's kind of helping me settle in after watching the movie.
Well, maybe one thing that we can do is, this film is it's well within our range of 10-year spoiler alert territory, right? 1980. And so I was thinking that, perhaps many viewers are going to be unfamiliar with this film, and it would be worth our time to maybe go around and kind of try to characterize the plot.
I think that's a great idea, especially since we usually encourage our viewers to watch the film before listening to us.
That's right. So disclaimer here.
This is a tough one to watch, however, so we can be colorful in the way that we describe it, describe what happens, who the characters are, and what are the outcomes, the foreseen outcomes, I would say.
Yeah, and so if you haven't seen it, you can kind of base whether you would actually want to, on our conversations and what we tell you.
We're going to give you a spoiler disclaimer right now, so if you haven't seen it yet and you want to watch it before hearing what we have to say, tune out, but there's going to be several probably disclaimers within disclaimers throughout this episode, because of its exploitative nature and for several reasons. Mm-hmm. But how would you describe I have kind of a way of describing the plot, but I want to hear from you all since you are more familiar with the film.
So I think this is the first found footage film, right? And it's not the most popular of films, but we just learned that in 1983 it was the second most highest grossing film in Japan.
Yeah, behind E.T. Behind E.T. You know, tells you something.
But yeah, so it's a found footage film, which means that in this case it has a frame, right? A frame narrative. And so the film picks up after 4 documentary filmmakers have gone missing in what is deemed the green zone of the Amazon rainforest, where 2 cannibalistic tribes are kind of constantly at war, and this documentary film of young, gung-ho filmmakers want to be the first to go into the green zone, take interesting footage, and come back and strike it rich and strike it famous. They never come back, however. Right? So the frame picks up with a professor from NYU who studies anthropology.
That's right.
Who is hired to follow in the footsteps of the 4 filmmakers and, first of all, see if they're alive. They're not. However, he endears himself to these 2 tribes in a way in order to gain the footage. So he goes into the jungle and retrieves the camera that these 4 filmmakers used to capture the horrors of what they saw. The rest of the film is showing the viewer that footage, and we watch it along with the NYU professor from the frame, and he's in contact with a company that wants to watch the this footage and commercialize it, make a profit off of it. And we're watching with them in the screening room, and we're noting their reactions to the film. They're disgusted like we are, and ultimately the panel decides to burn the material. So in the laws of our universe, Cannibal Holocaust is something that we could never see, right? It was not supposed to make it out of this story. And yet, of course, this is fiction, right? Which we'll get into the fictionality of the film. Many believed it to be true, apparently, watching it. But that's one of the things that I like most about the story is it's not just it's a found footage film that does a lot more, I would say, with the frame and returns to the frame than other found footage films in its wake.
Yeah, some don't even have a frame, right? Like Blair Witch doesn't really have a frame other than, the shots that say, oh, this was recovered footage or whatever.
Sure.
Do you guys want to add some color to the things you remembered or ways that you would describe the plot?
I think you did an excellent job of doing a kind of generous rendering of just the plot as what happens in the film. If I were to characterize the plot using maybe a little more colorful description, I would say that to me it felt like I was watching the gruesome origin story of how Burning Man came to be, with these 4 white kids going into the jungle to try to capture the essence of what being one with nature and being savage is all about, and finding the daily violence of the jungle enthralling and something worth capturing. But they're also, of course, as we'll talk about, manipulating how that story unfolds and what we get depicted, right? But I couldn't help but feel like almost zero redeeming character in the film, because it so much echoed some of the kind of tone-deaf language and things that I hear from the Burning Man crowd, right? Now, of course, the end result is much different than what the Burning Man is sort of at least claims to be, about finding a kind of communal connection and
right, simply living in that primal sense,
right.
Recapturing a former level of humanity in order to rebuild humanity as a more empathetic community.
Right, yeah, and really emphasize on liberating sexuality and liberating all kinds of conventions.
Right.
And
all of the things that we repress are finally able to be expressed.
Right, and there's a way in which I think that this film actually, to me, reads like the documentarian crew are the Urtex, the founders of a kind of Amazonian Burning Man, and yet then it also from pretty much the beginning is in the vein of horror, found footage horror, right? So it's clearly not actually the Burning Man origin footage, right? But that's the sense that I got. That's kind of the what was most horrific to me in the film that we can get into was the killing of actual live animals, but also the kind of ethos that seems to be just under the surface, and in many cases on top of the surface, right on the surface, that reminds me of that kind of aesthetic of tapping into a primal nature, but in a very strip mall kind of way, and feeling like you have to go to these remote locations and force those remote locations to fit the narrative that you came there with, right? And to me, that's at the heart of the Burning Man aesthetic too, is that you go to a place, call it transcendent before you get there. It's going to make you transcend. And by God, once you get there, then you're going to make sure that every way that you perceive everything that's going on fits into that narrative.
And that's what happens in Cannibal Holocaust, right? These young filmmakers, they understand the rhetorical situation of what they're stepping into and what their audience and themselves expect to find, right? That's gratuitous violence, rape, senseless killing. And when they don't find that, they have to enact it, right? They have to stage it. But the staging of that violence crumbles or turns in on itself as a conscious manipulation and becomes something that is a part of those filmmakers, right? Not something to stage, but just kind of draws out their own violent tendencies and their own kind of pure evil in this case.
Yeah, and I guess I was trying to, Josh, I don't know if there's any other way you can maybe and I don't really know that much about Burning Man, so I don't, but I kind of think I understand your point of what that is supposed to represent, this idea of going to the desert, and that is an authentic way of getting away from civilization and reconnecting. And I mean, I don't know that I saw that as part of what Cannibal Holocaust is trying to do. Like it seems to up front from the very beginning making it out that this is all fiction. Like this is there is no authentic. It's what the documentary crew is creating, right? So I guess I'm curious on why you are trying to compare it with this idea of authenticity, because I think from the beginning of the film we're meant to say, okay, that's not what's happening, because they even show that Alan, right, has done this kind of thing before. He's been to Africa, he's been to India,
been to Cambodia, Vietnam,
and he's staged things. He's paid soldiers to do scenes of violence.
Well,
right?
I'm saying that Burning Man is also inauthentic, but makes the claim of being authentic, right? So I'm saying that that's where the comparison is precisely that claim of authenticity that a documentary does, but the inauthenticity of actually doing it, right? So that you're. So another way of saying it is that it's crucial that these are white American students that are or documentarians that are going to these remote places with a preconceived story that they're going to force onto the screen through coercion and through initiating manipulative ways of getting violence to happen on screen, right? And the film comes out in 1980, and this being my first viewing, I also couldn't help but think about the ways in which, it reminded me a little bit of, this is a tangent, but it reminded me a little bit of Frederick Jackson Turner, who in 1893 laments the fact that America has defined itself by the frontier line, the friction point between savagery and civilization that has made this new germ, this new race that is American, that is uniquely not just a reproduction of Europe, but it's the friction point between the quote savage, the savageness of the indigenous peoples, right? Which of course is again an ugly characterization, but that's the words he uses, right? It's that friction point that creates the new race that is American. And in 1893, he's writing and speaking at the Chicago World's Fair and lamenting the fact that the 1890 census says there is no more frontier. Right. So how are we going to define ourselves as a nation, as a people, as this new quote race when there's no more frontier, right? When there's no more contact zone, right? And to me, this film is within that kind of framework in that it's seeking out spaces that you can continue to feel like you're engaging that contact zone. You're continuing to engage that friction point, right? But just as Frederick Jackson Turner's words at the Chicago World's Fair were once considered to be history, like he was doing legitimate historical readings of how the U.S. came into being, right? The University of Wisconsin names its its history department after Frederick Jackson Turner, still does today, right? It is now recognized not as historical fact, but as historical myth, right? That's the historical mythos of how Americans come to be, right? It leaves out the parts of violence and genocide and all the ways in which narratives get distorted, rhetoric gets used to characterize Native peoples as savage, right? And so I couldn't help but think that this film was perhaps not worried or thinking about at all Frederick Jackson Turner, although it does matter, I think, that the filmmaker is Italian. There's a lot of spaghetti westerns, Italian westerns, right?
Right.
So certainly familiar with people like Sergio Leone, right? Who makes lots of the spaghetti westerns. Yeah. So I couldn't help but feel that the film was doing a similar kind of work by thinking about the documentary form and the manipulations of the documentary form and the way that filmmakers can make that claim, that tease of authenticity and the tease of the real, right? But always in search of these contact zones where, you know, I can't even... You can make a drinking game out of Cannibal Holocaust out of the number of times they say the first time a white man has ever drank.
Yeah, right. This is the first civilized man.
This is the first white man, the first civilized man, right? And so it's all about finding those contact zones on the one hand, but I have...
Do you read those ironically in the film, right? Because when Alan's saying, all right, this is the first civilized man to enter the green zone, I'm like, yeah, no, it's not. Like, there isn't. If you're claiming that ground for yourself, right, that's false.
Yeah. Right, and everything that comes out of his mouth we know to be suspect. Also, when you say green zone, do you mean green inferno? Because that's the phrase that he uses, the green inferno.
Green inferno, yeah. I thought I heard green zone too, right? It's that area where there are these two warring cannibalistic tribes. Right, warring, right? That might be Alan's kind of willing that into being. Right, he's staging all this violence. But I want to talk about for a second about the film, right? So we can judge Alan, right? He's very easy to dismiss, right? The ethics of the film and the complexities of the film's message, or how simple the film's message is, right? Sure. Whether the film is exploitative or not. And I want to start with the idea that, you know, you guys have been mentioning all of this, the staging and the manipulations within the story. I'm thinking that they might be distracting from this staging and the manipulations of the film itself, right? So this is, Ruggero Deodato is hiring these actors in the Amazon to kind of do his bidding and perform in a certain way. And the film is very critical of the way that history gets told, right, or that history gets represented. And it's very critical of the narratives, the comforting narratives that would reach a Western audience if Alan's film passed as truth, right? However, Alan's film, if within the film, right, if they had released his unedited footage, right, to the public the public would learn that the way that history gets recorded in these contact zones or in these regions, right, is completely perspectival, right? In fact, burning the film preserves the message, the kind of dyad between civilized and uncivilized.
Right, because doing that, all people know is that this documentary crew went into the Amazon and got killed.
That's right.
They don't know why it happened.
The very fact of that would confirm the Green Zone or the Green Inferno as a place where
that is dangerous
that kind of
and
happens, right?
There's these cannibals there that are murderous.
But Professor Monroe's narrative shows, or is meant to show in the film, right, that if you respect the culture, right, if you don't violate it, right, you can survive such a scenario.
Right. I mean, I think that that's where the complexities also are a way to talk around how the simplicity, right? And so, like, one thing that I would say, just based on what your observation is that what's hard for me about this movie is that while I take the point about how the film is sort of critiquing how history is told through the found footage, when we actually get the found footage and it's Alan and his crew, right? I think that the frame is exploitative.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
That the frame, which is meant to be the thing that we counterbalance how the narrative is told, right?
Yeah.
That, like, there was no moment in the movie in which I thought that the indigenous peoples were depicted as not being savage, as being complex and valuing life and having a whole epistemology.
That gets
right?
back to the staging of the entire film.
That's
This is what I want to talk about, right?
Yeah.
Even the moments where, like, oh, look, if you treat these natives with respect, right, if you do that, they'll feed you a human body for dinner, right? Or
they're so far removed from any kind of technology that they'll think you're a god.
That's right.
If you show them shiny trinkets.
It maintains the white... It does two things. It maintains the white savior idea, right, at the same time that it demonizes white intervention, right? And the white savior idea is part of that frame that is supposed to redeem the film. But I'll say, this isn't my top 5 films of all time, and it is. The reason is these problems.
Sure.
Right? This is the reason. I don't think that it's a great work of art or anything like that, right? It's the problematics of the film and its attempt to offer a more sophisticated message that also fails. That makes it interesting to me.
Yeah. I mean, I think the whole idea of... Well,
don't watch it.
Yeah, that's a simple takeaway. Don't watch this movie. Yeah. But I mean, Josh, you mentioned in our pre-show discussion, like this spectator versus spectacle idea, and I mean, this is something that I think, even though this is kind of the first found footage film, it goes back to a long film tradition. And Hitchcock, for example, is known for this, right? With things like Rear Window, for example. And it's kind of, on the one hand, it wants to indict, or Psycho, with him watching, Marion getting undressed and all that. And at the same time, it's kind of drawing attention to the artificiality of film and, like, comparing these sort of sadistic, voyeuristic gaze to what the viewer is doing, because the viewer is also a watcher, right? So that kind of thing has been going on, I think, in film for a long time.
Can I just say that the viewer is also a watcher, and the filmmaker is also a profiteer. Like Ruggero Deodato, like Alan, is making money, right? So I'm looking at the figures right here. He spends $100,000 in the budget, and he makes $2 million at the box office. Right? That's Alan. That's Alan Yates' money. Yeah. Right? Anyway, I'm sorry to cut you off.
Oh yeah, and then the other thing I just wanted to add into this, so I don't know if that changes how we think about the film, but just kind of noting that I think is important to recognize. This is something films have tried to get away with for a long time, and often people like Hitchcock do get away with it. Like, you know, he is one of the most respected filmmakers of all time, right? But he has done that kind of very thing where we identify, we were able to identify this sort of sadistic or exploitative nature of people who are like voyeurs and gazing at people while we are also doing the same thing. Like he's helping us to enjoy the pleasure of doing that same thing. Also,
and is being critical of it at the same time.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But also, obviously, he still wants us to watch his film. Right.
The direction I thought you were going to take when you brought up Hitchcock is that his desire, his stated desire in several interviews, is not to have his audience enjoy the movie, right? It's to, quote, put them through it, right? So he is trying to, in his film world, his idea of film, and this is a boiling down of a complex, big, he's done a number of different films, right? But one of the things that he's trying to do is to, quote, put you through it, put you through the kind of different set of emotions that come through as a spectator. And I thought that was going to be the direction you were going to go, because if nothing else, Cannibal Holocaust puts you through it.
Oh,
right?
yeah,
That's the kind of thing, and it is doing the Rear Window kind of thing, in that it's allowing us to watch somebody else watch and create narrative and misunderstanding, and yet it's also something entirely different that it's hard for me to put my finger on, like where the line is there and why Hitchcock doesn't get, to me it's pretty easy to just come out and say I know why, but I guess it would take a while to unpack why it is that Hitchcock's Psycho, while inspiring some outrage in some circles, right, doesn't go to trial in this, as Cannibal Holocaust has to, right? Which I also think is another interesting layer of this story, is that this film gets put on trial for obscenity, and it, to me, there's several ways of even trying to unpack and read that part of the narrative, the obscenity trial that the afterlife of the film goes through, because watching it today, it's hard for me to understand how anyone that watched the film could have felt that, for instance, the violence against the people was actually happening, right? That was real. But I can see how, like, a viewer today can be totally turned off by the violence against animals that we see, and why someone can be critical of the film's exploitation of the indigenous people. That it, like, yes, I do get what you're saying, that it allows us to be critical of the documentarian, be critical of how narrative and history is constructed, but even in its frame that we're supposed to identify with a little bit more and be a little more disgusted with, right? Or like share their disgust with what's happening. Yeah. Even that is really exploitative and really, like, not very nuanced in its depiction.
And to go back to the incredible staging that the director does, right, in the movie, that Ruggero Deodato is manipulating the outrage, the response to his film, that response of outrage. That's why, like, the levels of exploitation that, Deodato has kind of said that simple narrative, like, who's the real savage?
I wonder who the real cannibals are.
Is the thing that redeems the film, right? And that the exploitation happens within the film and is not as much a part of the film itself, right? That, I don't believe that one bit. In fact, the going to trial is a direct result of a contract that he had with his actors to stay out of the public spotlight for an entire year. And we can't deny that the trial has added to the kind of cultishness of the film as one of the main draws of the film. And I think that the ability of the film to sell itself as extremely authentic and presenting us with a genuine violence has to be compared to the thing that the film is trying to critique, right? Which is violence for profit, right? And that the redeeming moral of the film is merely a way to add to exploitative value, right? That's why I really think it's like, honestly, like one of the it's really stupid. It's like it's a really weird experiment that makes me like that it exists for some reason, right? These narratives within it, like the narrative in the film, the frame narrative, the narrative of the trial, the narrative that grants this film this cult status, right? All those things are a lot like the other.
Yeah, the quick thing that I'll add to that is that it makes you, at least me, it makes me want to have all of these gut reactions, and then also it makes me want to have be able to try to engage with it on its complexities as I'm starting to realize the layers, and then it also makes me want to dismiss it as being like just something that has no redeeming quality, right? It's producing a lot of complex reactions for me that, so on one hand, I can really like celebrate it as being something like, wow, very few movies make me feel this way. In fact, I don't know that any have, right? And in part, it's because it gives you still that sense of something that you watched that you weren't supposed to, which is kind of a familiar territory for the horror fan, I think, right? Is that like part of the joy of horror is that we're not supposed to like it that much, right? Or it's for enjoyment, it's for entertainment, but it's in many cases the thing that you're watching is not supposed to be enjoyable, right? And yet it is. And it definitely taps into that. But a question I can ask myself is like, would I ever teach this, right? Do I think that there's enough here to like critique the some of the things I would normally teach about like how we tell the stories of history, and it does all of those themes, but I am not going to have my students watch a turtle get murdered. And I'm not going to like because I study and focus on Native American literature in my own work, like the representation of Native peoples here, I'm fine with like watching and talking about Pocahontas, the Disney film, which is a terrible representation of Native peoples, right? But I don't know that I could do this, right? Because there's something, another layer that is hard for me to work through. But again, it's sort of feeding into a long history of representations that claim a kind of complexity because it has the frame and because it's asking that question about who's the real savage, right? But really isn't all that complex, right? And so I agree with you in part. This is like kind of amazing for me to feel that like very strongly in two different directions. Like in one sense, I really do agree with you that there's a lot to chew on in this, and that makes it interesting. But I'm also like so disgusted by it.
You're disgusted
and
by
frustrated.
Its simplicity and its incredible violence to make its kind of very simple point that is pretty off-putting. Yeah,
that's right.
But I guess where I was going with the Hitchcock comparison is I feel like the reason people have such a strong reaction to it is because it goes to such extreme lengths. But I guess the question I have is it really fundamentally different the way it manipulates us into kind of accepting this message or accepting the fact that it's critiquing something that it's also taking part in? Is that not the same thing that people like Hitchcock have done? Or that, I mean, to go back to our introductory podcast when we asked that question about what's your moral stance about watching certain films that do things like sexualize violence and your comfort level with that. We accept those kind of things even as we criticize them. But I guess for me, like, if we can accept that in those other films,
It's different here, though.
okay,
Yeah.
Because
how
it's-
so?
Because it's not just the violence of a murder or a kind of twisted mind. It's like a geographical binary that is pitting an entire like race
Yeah.
against an entire another race. So I think like the stakes are higher politically for what Deodato is wanting us to critique, and he's participating in it at the same time. It's a little. It attributes that impulse to like an entire race of people. You know what I mean?
But I guess, I mean, are you saying then you think that one of the things the film is doing is like reinforcing a particularly like idea of the savage? Then that these are
Yes.
dangerous, violent.
Yes, even
Yeah.
even when it's trying to prove to us that look, we're like them,
Mhm.
right? And in the very ability to try to
That's right.
to make that message shows me that the film and its filmmakers kind of buy into it at the same time, that it's something that needs proving,
Right.
right? And so I'm critical of that. The thing that maybe there's, I don't know if you guys noticed, the acting in the Cannibal Holocaust is fucking awful, right? It's pretty bad, I thought. And there's especially when Professor Monroe, who has a stupid pipe in every scene, walks out of the screening room at NYU and he looks up at the Twin Towers and he smokes
Half a
his...
tie, just like straight out of An American Werewolf in London.
He's
Go
got-
back and rewatch. His tie is cut.
You gotta be... The professor doesn't care about faction.
Yeah.
You know, as aspiring professors,
Yeah.
we know that. But he smokes his pipe, he looks up at the Twin Towers, the camera pans up and he goes, I wonder who's the real savage, right? And it has this staginess, this kind of camp to it,
Mhm.
that, like, I wonder, and I'm sure I'm giving Ruggero Deodato way too much credit here,
Mhm.
but the simplicity of that line and the way it's delivered and the aura of the scene maybe makes the film possibly aware of the simplicity of its own
Well,
message
that's my
as a-
point. I don't think Ruggero Deodato thought he was making some kind of profound political or social statement with
That's
that.
how he defended it at trial, though.
Mhm.
You know?
No, he defended a trial with the fact
Well,
that the
yeah.
people weren't actually killed during the making of the film. Like, I mean, and of course, everyone who has gone through these obscenity trials has tried to make that claim, even if in interviews they're like, yeah, we're just having fun or whatever. Like, they're not actually trying to make some kind of profound message. One thing we should remember, too, about the history of this is that there are two sort of strains of film that are playing into this, and one of them being the Mondo films. That Josh, are you familiar with these?
No.
So in the 60s, the late 60s and the 70s, they were called Mondo films. I forget what the term means, but they were these faux documentary films, much like we see of what Ellen did with, having the soldiers stage violence,
Cool.
where people would go to places like Africa or to the Amazon or wherever, and they would film either, soldiers or supposedly native peoples doing certain violent things. And sometimes it would be real, sometimes it would be fake, or a combination of the two. And these would be shown at like grindhouse type of places,
Sure.
So that was kind of a thing that this film, I think, was kind of playing upon, is the sort of explosion of that and the explosion of the grindhouse exploitation cinema. The other thing is the history of the snuff film, which I think is one of the reasons why it went to trial, because people were paranoid about that there were these films being circulated of people being murdered on film, which I don't know that much about the history, but from what I've read, is not true, that wasn't actually a thing that was actually happening, but that the FBI and police were, investigating this, thinking it was actually a thing. I think Charlie Sheen or something received some kind of movie that was kind of a collage of clips from various things that was supposed to be an actual snuff film, and he like alerted the FBI, and it was actually, you know, it was all completely fake stuff, but they thought it was real, you know. And so I guess I just that history, I think, of people not knowing what is true or not, being paranoid about the violence being real, and also the history of being, I mean, horror movies are manipulative, I feel like. To me, that is the case. Like, we're manipulated into being pleasurably watching people get killed. And this is a very extreme form of that, and I take the point of, like, it's exploiting indigenous people. I feel like actually I'm more disturbed by the animal violence and the sexual violence, even though the sexual violence is staged. That still is very disturbing to me, as it is in things like slasher films where violence is eroticized. You know, so I'm more disturbed by that, I guess, because to me, and I guess looking back, maybe when it first came out, people would have had the reaction of like, oh, this is reinforcing the idea of the violent savage. But for me, it's not about that at all. Like, it's not really about the indigenous people. It's about the exploitation of the indigenous people. But
that's happening from the filmmakers of Cannibal Holocaust too, I think, is important.
No, I agree. I mean, I see what you're saying. Like, they're also they're profiting from the exploitation of indigenous people, while also
in fact
criticizing the exploitation of indigenous people.
Their very entry into, you know, their justification for being able to show us all of this violence that takes place is this moral stance that the film seems to take. And I compare the moral stance of the film with Alan's own kind of staging of violence within the narrative itself.
Right.
Like, it's very simple.
Well, and I mean, my response though is that, like, because it sounds like what you're saying is that the indigenous encounter, the contact zone, is like the less important part of the film, but then, like, why isn't it an alien encounter film, right? Like, what? Because it essentially kind of is, actually. It's an alien invasion film in many ways. If you just if the native indigenous population in the film is that replaceable, then why not replace them? Why require to have that contact, and not only have that contact, but have it in that stereotyped way where we're seeing them brutalize women, we're seeing them cannibalize white people, right? We're seeing them in all of these ways that are reinforcing this idea of being in a savage space, and that it doesn't justify, right? I think we are ultimately supposed to sympathize with the indigenous people over the filmmakers, and I see where you're heading there, right? But I guess what I'm trying to say is that we can think about it in a really complicated way, trying to use intersectionality and thinking. I'm not even going to kind of like unpack that, but the scene where we get the ritualized violence, right? This is in the frame, right? This is in the frame narrative. We get Professor Monroe having to be quiet while he watches a woman get drugged from a canoe to a post, get raped with a foreign object by presumably her husband for committing adultery, right? And then get beaten to death and put back into the canoe and pushed away. And we're getting that described to us by the professor, who is supposed to have expertise here, and says that we're getting it described to us not by the professor, but by his native companion, who says that this is like the way of the jungle. This is he must do this, or his tribe will kill him, right? And my whole point with saying all this is that I don't know that we can deny the important role of how that how indigeneity is being represented here in order to be the backdrop for this other narrative about how history is told. Like it is the backdrop, and to me that's partly the problem with the film. I'm not expecting any film, in particular the horror film, to give perfect representations. That's not my point, right? But there's a way in which this disturbs me because the backdrop is so crucial to the message that the film is trying to tell, and yet it allows for that reading of, well, I'm more disturbed by the animal violence, which I'm also very much disturbed by, right?
Yeah.
But like so it's hard for me to separate those things, I guess.
Oh yeah, and I agree. I mean, we shouldn't separate those things. I guess maybe I shouldn't have said that those things are more, the animal violence and the sexual violence. I mean, because that scene is sexual violence.
That's right.
Right. That's what's disturbing to me.
That's
like,
right.
I think that it would be less disturbing if it would be like they were killed and they were fighting with each other and killed each other or something like that. It would not be as disturbing.
Sure.
But my point is more that I don't think the fact of it using the sort of indigenous encounter as a way of doing the film makes it any worse or like any different than any other film that uses sexualized violence or violence as sort of it has the thing where it wants us to be pleased by it, but also upset by it and disturbed by it, right? That it wants us to. I think that Carol Clover says that we switch identification between the killer in the slasher, right, to the lead, the final girl, but we are identifying with both, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and I would say that this one thing to say about this film, whether I think you can't. I hope you can't watch it and not be disturbed by it, right?
Yeah, really.
So like, I don't want to hang out with you if you're not disturbed by it, right? This is like for real. Like we can't be friends if you're not disturbed by that. Like it's disturbing, right?
Well, and that's what I said. That when I first showed this to Matt, I told him about it and he showed interest, but I was also worried of his reaction because I felt like if he was very disturbed by this, he might not only be disturbed by the film, but he might be disturbed by me showing the film to him.
Oh, good Lord. It's unbelievable. It's horrible. I can't understand the reason for such cruelty.
And think there's something wrong with this guy for showing me this because I recognize it's not something that we should be talking about as something that is like purely pleasurable or something that someone with a healthy psychological state should be looking at uncritically.
Well, and I mean, you brought up a good point, I think, about the ways in which we can see Cannibal Holocaust really shifting our identifications and actually disorienting us in sometimes the most pleasurable ways in the film, or I don't know if pleasurable is the right word, but like in the most satisfying ways, the moments of the film, it's like trying to figure out who we're supposed to identify with, where are we supposed to identify, because it's giving us these different encounters, but also showing us these characters that are very unlikable. And so I think that that's one thing that is really complicated, right? But I do hope we talk a little bit about one of the issues that you're really calling attention to, which is its depiction throughout of sexual violence. Yeah. Because I think that is an incredibly charged thing that gets depicted in horror often, that should always make us uncomfortable. And this film is, in particular, really doubling down on trying, I think, to make us feel uncomfortable with that encounter. And yet, I would rather hear what you guys have to say before I do my end yet and kind of go off, right? But I guess the question that I have related to the sexual violence is, like, in what ways do you see the film trying to critique our spectatorship, make us feel uncomfortable, in other words, right? And in what ways do you see or feel the film is, like, reinforcing a pleasure or policing sexuality? Like, how do you read those scenes? How do you make sense of those
Can
scenes?
I comment on that?
Please.
Yeah.
First, I want to say that, Andrew, I'm very happy that you introduced me to this film.
Okay, I'm glad you don't hate me or think
As you
I
know-
am some kind of
As you know, I have this...
wacko.
Andrew left... He won the Cannibal Holocaust soundtrack as, like, a record at a horror movie event he went to, and he brought it to my house and left it there, and it's still at my house. I could have brought it today, knowing that we'd see Cannibal Holocaust, but I didn't because I like listening to it so much. It's really cool. It's a green record, and when you put it on the record player, this is pretty hard to describe, but the record has a picture of the crucified woman's mouth opening, and then you put it on the silver thing, and it goes through her mouth. It's awesome. I'll also say that Andrew probably should have known that I liked it, because it in many ways parallels Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness.
Sure does.
And not just in the way that it's somebody who goes into a savage territory and becomes one of the savages. That's not the only right.
Burn.
It's when Marlowe gets Kurtz's report on savage customs.
Yeah. We're talking Heart of Darkness.
We're talking
here.
about Heart of Darkness. When Marlowe gets Kurtz's report, which famously, after all of these kind of grand phrases about how the white savior and how primitive people are, right? The postscript of Kurtz's document is exterminate all the brutes.
Yeah.
Exterminate all the brutes. Right? And it's the one bit of truth in that document. And what Marlowe does before giving it to a journalist is he rips off the postscript. Mm-hmm. And that's what circulates his history, right? So Conrad is very critical of the edits that happen in historical representations, right? What happens here? They burn the film, right? It doesn't circulate. But just like Heart of Darkness, which is an artistic document, so is Cannibal Holocaust, and we can watch it, right? The reader, within the story world, it's burned, but the readers and the viewers can actually experience it and learn that lesson, right? Anyway, read Heart of Darkness, I guess is the message, but there are really cool parallels, even though Conrad's novel is like it's more sophisticated in every sense than Cannibal Holocaust is. But to return to your question about, and just to state it back at you before I answer it here, is where in the film is Deodato, right, being critical of the pleasures that we get out of sexual violence, and where is he indulging?
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay. I think the film sets us up to be kind of intrigued by nudity, honestly. Like, one of the first scenes, right, there are a couple of, like, non-violent sexual scenes that come before the mutilation of bodies and the raping of women, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that that's a purposeful trajectory, right? The idyllic kind of bathing in the waters with the girls of the tribe, right? Even that humorous video of the filmmakers kind of pulling the towel away from Faye. There's like a kind of joking quality to it and whatnot. And I think that's, meant to provoke our interest in some way and kind of, I don't know, turn us on. Yeah, turn us on. Sure. Right? And then what happens in the narrative within the narrative, right, is this incredible raping of bodies that's, is exploitative in an extremely physical way that I think is meant to, comment on what these people are doing to the land, right, to the tribe as a whole and whatnot. And so what happens to me over the course of the film is, having watched it a second time, right, it's hard to get excited about scenes of nudity, knowing what's to come. But I think it's a part of the structure of the film is to show us a certain playfulness associated with sexuality, right, before revealing those images of gruesome transgressions and penetration. And that crossing of boundaries that we get later. So I think ultimately it's very self-conscious in how it's critical of sexuality, right? It associates sexuality too with power, right? Alan wants to have sex with Faye in front of a tribe because he doesn't care, right? He wants to be the king, right?
Or he has sex with her after having set the villagers on fire.
Yeah.
Right.
That's the allusion to the title, like Cannibal Holocaust.
Like
It's probably the
literally.
clearest kind of allusion to the title
That's
of the
right.
film.
Right. Right. So it's like a Holocaust of cannibals,
Right.
right? Rather than what you might think
Right.
Cannibal
Yeah.
Holocaust would
Yeah.
suggest.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I so the way I read it is that it's not trying to make, and this is kind of the way I read our identification with the Professor Monroe, where I do give Deodato credit for that, not because I think he was thinking at a sophisticated level, just because I think it's kind of the wink, the same, I keep coming back to Hitchcock, I don't know why, but the same kind of wink Hitchcock does with the viewers of he's manipulating you, and you know he's manipulating you, but you're still like, he's doing it in a way that you are along for the ride, because I take the sexual violence as exactly what you said, where he's titillating us, drawing us in,
Yes.
making us interested, only to then make our visceral reactions that much stronger when the horrific parts come in. Like, we're drawn in, we're interested, we're like, oh yeah, this is gonna be great, and then you see the really effed up stuff, right? And then that makes it that much hitting that much harder, which is something I'm not saying like that justifies it. I'm just saying like I think it's a purely like narrative or on a level of like a sort of technique, a sort of filmmaker's technique of wanting to manipulate the audience in that way and having fun with trying to say like, look, I know I'm manipulating you. These people are manipulating everything, but you know what? You're going to be suckered into it just as these people are.
Yeah, I think so. I have a really short answer to how I read the sexual violence, but before that, because you use the word wink to say that it's making that you see Professor Monroe kind of making a wink in a similar way that Hitchcock gives us the wink and the nod to like recognizing our own spectatorship and how to deal with that, right? And my reading of Professor Monroe, so this is less my answer about the reading of sexual violence, but my reading of Professor Monroe as a character really reminds me, he is a professor of anthropology, right? And he reminds me a lot of Clifford Geertz, who is a cultural anthropologist, very famous for what he called thick description in his attempts to teach his students how to go into spaces like the Amazon and write about them as an outsider who's trying to immerse themselves in there, right? He gives the example of the wink, right? And this is his demonstration of how, as an ethnographer, you need to be able to thickly describe all the possible ranges of meaning before you can start writing about a culture that's foreign to you.
Before you
right?
make a claim,
Before
that
you
is
make a claim.
often going to be
Right.
self-serving if it's not thought out.
Right, so he uses the gesture of the wink. I often do this with my own students. I will wink at a student and then ask the rest of my students to say, what did that mean? Right? And we'll talk about all the range of meanings, even within our shared cultural experience.
I do this too, and I always pick a male.
I always wink at a male student, and usually one that kind of thinks of themselves as being the kind of hot shot of the class. I usually do that to make them uncomfortable, and I never usually reveal my own sexual preferences or anything like that in the classroom.
So why don't we do it right now? We'll
Right.
say to our audience, right?
So
you wink.
I wink at Andrew.
So audience members,
What does a wink mean?
what does a wink mean? What are all of the possibilities right now on this podcast? Josh is winking at Andrew.
Unfortunately, you
Right.
can't see it.
Yeah, he can't
It's
see
a
it,
pretty
right?
sexy wink.
Yeah, I have a radio face, so we are, we're on the radio here. But I'm making the winking gesture. I promise you, this is true, right? What does a wink mean, right? And so,
what are the things?
Here are some of the things that my students answer, right? So, a wink can mean like a shared secret, right? We're winking
in on some secret knowledge.
Yeah. Probably the most obvious is that a wink can be flirtation, right? Sexual flirtation, right? A wink can also mean an inside joke of some kind, right? The winky face emoji means, a range of things, but it usually is somewhat playful or sexual in some way, right? But it can also mean sarcasm or a joke or like you don't take this part seriously, right?
It can mean what you just said does not apply to this kid.
Right? And we can continue to add to the layers of the thing that the wink means, but I always end with, well, it could have just been physiological. I could have just had something in my eye.
Twitched.
And you recognized it as being packed with this other meaning.
And you added symbolic meaning to it.
Right? And so in some ways, I feel like that lesson applies to how we are trying to make meaning of the sexual violence that is depicted on the screen, right? I do take both of your points that the film is giving us multiple versions of sexuality in the film, right? Multiple versions of sex between characters, right? So we do get...
Self-consciously.
Right, self-consciously.
Right, playfulness followed by gruesomeness.
Right? And I would say that we're getting disabused of like our puritanical Western version of nudity, right? Of the fear of nudity or the fear of seeing the naked body, right? We're getting disabused throughout the film of that so that it's maybe less titillating pretty early on in the film to see nudity, right? Of both the male and female form.
Yeah, right? one of the few films that is not abashed about showing male genitalia.
Full frontal,
you see a lot of dicks in this.
That's right.
Almost probably double digits.
That's right. And yet, what I want to say, the very kind of baseline thing that I want to say about the sexual violence in this film is that to me, it is fundamentally sexual violence that is about the question, who is more savage, right? And so sexual violence becomes the way in which we make that a complicated question in order to kind of not have to think critically about the sexual violence, right? So like what I'm saying here is that the sexual violence that we see happens across the different lines, right? So we have indigenous people committing sexual violence against women, right? Early on, that's one of the first encounters we get with the native peoples, right?
The adulteress's punishment.
We get that, right? And then we see white women getting attacked by native people at the end of the film, and in between we have white men attacking indigenous women, and I think that it's all a way of kind of using sexual violence as the symbol that we trace to get to that final question, who is the more savage, right? But to me, that's really where I feel gross about finishing the film, and maybe that's the intended effect, or like what I'm supposed, like maybe that's not a bad thing that we take that really kind of ugly feeling away from watching this film, right? But to me, there's a really simple answer. There's lots of complicated ways we can talk about how we read that sexual violence and maybe what the filmmaker is doing to lead us to those readings. But to me, the entire film is sort of hinging on how women get treated determines who is more savage or not. And the answer that the film gives us is that women get brutalized by both, and there is no civilized, therefore, right? And to me, that's just kind of the cop out of the film, that it actually again uses these depictions in a way that isn't about interrogating that question, but about kind of throwing the hands up at the end.
So kind of saying, men use, for men, power and sexual violence are linked, and then it throws its hands up. Let me ask you a question that maybe complicates this a little bit. What do you make of so if sexual violence is so important to the message of the film here, surely the castration, which is incredibly vivid and realistic, and probably honestly one of the worst shots of the film, right, when Jack gets castrated by a sharp rock towards the end. What do you make of that? So if there's this throwing up of hands and sexual violence is equated on both sides of the spectrum here, and the white filmmakers have raped, right, and abused these indigenous tribes, what do you make of the fact that, and is this a symbolic moment where the tribe castrates one of the members of the crew? Is that kind of like a taking back of power, or a critique of Western narcissism, or Western power? What do you make of the castration
just
scene?
that these indigenous people are so horrible that they're going to cut off
Well,
their dick?
that's another thing. Yeah, exactly.
No, I
Exactly.
mean, I think it's more along those lines. I think
Yeah.
that this is part. It gets hard to articulate, but I'm getting really close to
But
saying.
this is why I like it so much.
Yeah.
Right? The simplicity of that cutting off of that guy's dick as chalked up to just the violence of the tribe versus its role in the kind of thematics of the film.
No, what I was going to say is that
Both answers kind of work.
I think that to me it leans much more on the more simple answer. And what I'll say here is that
I don't know about that.
I think that for me the answer is that the film is very comfortable showing the indigenous peoples and white men as being capable of grave brutality against women, particularly as it relates to their sexuality, right? And
the adulteress's punishment, right, is an act of incredible sexual violence, but it is also an act that is supposed to uphold certain rules of sexual regulations. You know what I mean?
right, but it's also an invented ritual, right?
Yes.
And that's my point. Is that so? Like the film is inventing rituals that reinforce this idea of indigenous savagery, and then
In a profound respect for virginity.
right, and then is ending the film with a man who gets castrated as a kind of comeuppance because he's one of the men that has raped one of the women from the tribe, right? And so to me, the reading is that it's a pretty simple reading about how men in both cases are being depicted as being the purveyors of justice as it relates to what happened, what women are allowed to do sexually, right? And I'm not expecting the film to make a liberatory message. I'm just saying that it doesn't require a lot of close reading skills, in my estimation, to recognize that the film we're supposed to, I feel, recognize that as not a totally gruesome act, but one that we are like almost rooting for. Like, this dude deserves this.
Yeah. Well, the thing I was going to say about this is that, and this might be the moment where you think I am the wacko that I was afraid you would think I am.
It's already been established.
Yeah.
I am disturbed by many scenes in this film. When the scene we've been talking about of the adulteress getting punished, I want to turn away from. The scene where the white men of the documentary crew are raping the indigenous woman, I want to turn away from. The scenes where animals, especially the turtle scene where they're getting killed, I want to turn away from. When the white documentary crew are getting killed, I am reveling in that. I am like, yes, this is what should happen, right? And I guess it depends on what your perspective of this kind of revenge scenario is, because I have to admit that there is a certain pleasure that I get out of certain kind of revenge films,
Sure.
specifically rape. It's usually rape revenge, right?
Sure.
Films like Last House on the Left,
Sure.
I Spit on Your Grave, one of the most another very controversial film. When the sexual violence against the woman happens, it's very disturbing. When the woman, or in Last House on the Left, it's the parents take the revenge upon the rapists. Mm-hmm. There's a certain pleasure in that. So that's my reaction to it. Whether it's the castration or anything else that is happening, it's like that's what we want to see.
Sure.
We've been led up. All the other really disturbing, messed up stuff that has happened before that is leading up to that. And early on that these people have died. It's not a spoiler.
Sure.
Because when you start watching the film, they come upon their skeletal remains, right?
Mm-hmm.
These people have been killed. The question is why? What did they do?
Yes.
What is Professor Monroe says, what is the unspeakable crime that would have led... He doesn't know that much about these tribes at this point, but he said he knows enough about them to know that they would not do this unless they violated something extremely profound, right? And so we're just waiting for that, and it kind of sets us up. We see all these... It's kind of like the defeat... I keep comparing this to a slasher. I had not thought of that comparison before going into this discussion, but I keep thinking of it's kind of like the comeuppance of the final girl towards the slasher, right? Mm-hmm. We enjoy seeing the slasher killer picking people off one by one, but then we also enjoy seeing the final girl then defeat him, right? Mm-hmm. I feel like there's a similar dynamic happening here. Again, that does not necessarily... excuse or negate the sort of exploitative nature isn't what is happening, but I guess my question, which is a little more uncomfortable, is that exploitative thing something that is happening? This is just giving us an extreme version of it, but is something that is also happening in so many other films, not even just slashers, but other films that we enjoy, where we enjoy seeing people get killed off, or we enjoy violence happening, and then we enjoy the resolution of that, right?
Sure. No, I think
we're permitted to enjoy the resolution,
right?
Because it carries a sense of justice.
Exactly. Yeah, sense of justice,
a fatedness.
And maybe that's where this film is more difficult, is that you usually do get that kind of justice in the slasher that you're describing. You usually get the scene. I've described it in earlier podcasts of being the slasher as being a film that's one of my broad claims is that it's about the mask, but the other is that it's about seeing primarily young teenagers being thrust into situations of grave injustice that they don't deserve to be in, and yet they have to fight their way through. And usually the final girl is the one that we end up, she discovers something about herself that she didn't know was there before, and is able to not repress or hide from the monster, but confront the monster.
Well, is that happening in Cannibal Holocaust?
And that's my point, is that I don't think there is, to me, the kind of enough of a clear justice scene at the end to negate what got us to that point, I guess. You know what I mean? I don't know if negate... I feel like I don't want to be guilty here of trying to put too much morality policing onto the film, because that's I don't want to get into that so much. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that maybe it's because there's the frame element, right? That they're watching what happens, and part of what's disturbing about the frame is that all the way up until they watch the rape scene together, the crew, with the exception of the professor, want to turn it into a documentary, and they've already seen horrible things, right? They've already seen things that should not probably be broadcast, right?
Yeah. Right.
And so there's something disturbing about that. I mean, I guess we are also watching it, and that's part of what you're calling attention to, is it's burned in the world of the film, but we are enjoying it and watching it. And enjoying is probably the wrong word.
That's what I think is the wink.
But and that's kind of the wink, right? And there is something to be said for that like it invites you to be outraged, but then also to be like, well, you watched it, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it wants viewers to be outraged, though. I think it wants us to like be indulgent, and then while at the same time like saying, aren't you so messed up for enjoying this? Mm-hmm. But that's more of a like almost maybe a reverse psychology kind of thing, like because people at this point were trying to up the they talk about this in the film. They're trying to up the sensationalism.
Today, people want sensationalism. The more you rape their senses, the happier they are.
Ah, yes, that's typical Western thought. Civilized, isn't it? That's what Alan thought, and that's why he's dead.
Right. Yeah. They're trying to make the most shocking film possible. I mean, Dawn of the Dead was trying to do that, right? Trying to up the gore factor, the controversy over these snuff films. That's why I kind of brought that up is Herschel Gordon Lewis, since the late 60s was making these extremely low budget but also extremely graphic and gory films that people are like, what? This guy must be deranged. Why is he doing this? Why is he showing such extreme blood and evisceration and gore? The movie is like bringing up this question of should we be enjoying this or not? But ultimately, it's coming down on the side of, yes, enjoy it. Yeah. I'm going to make you question that enjoyment, but not in a way that is, like, serious.
See, I feel like I'll take your word, and I believe that there is a wink or several winks, but I'm not sure what kind in this film, right? I'm not sure I can define what kind of wink it is or if it is just something in their eye, right? I don't know yet if the winks that we're getting are really winks that the film even knows what we're supposed to do with what we're watching, right? In some cases, I feel like the film is just like putting it in front of us and then not trying to shape how we feel about it, with the exception of, we are getting soundtrack. In many ways, we should talk about the soundtrack because it's so it creates such disharmony with what is being depicted, right? And I think that to me actually reinforces what I'm trying to say, is that it leaves room for so much disharmony in your reaction. And in many ways, that is like I've claimed previously to really love that about a film, that it leaves that feeling open. But with this, I still am not sure yet what kind of wink the filmmaker is giving, or whether or not I want to say that I like this or not. I have a theory about the soundtrack.
Yeah. This, and you love the soundtrack, right?
Yeah, I do. Here's my theory about the soundtrack, and I think this has something to do with the wink.
And can you just give listeners who is the person who's composed the soundtrack?
You should all download his album. I don't even know if he's alive or not, but perhaps his family will get the money, a little portion of the money you spend on his iTunes soundtrack, whatnot. But his name is Riz Ortolani.
And it is a very beautiful
It's a beautiful soundtrack. And here's my theory about it. Right? So, the music is, you can call it's beautiful music, and it's simultaneously uplifting and meant to be dramatic. And I think that the film might be critical of itself as something to be enjoyed, because the soundtrack that is used within the film, it's also implied that it's the same soundtrack that Alan used in his recording of footage of African wars and execution, right? So there's a moment of uncertainty where the kind of moving, uplifting quality of the soundtrack is applied to the film within the film within the film, right? Alan's previous footage of those African wars in Cambodia or what, right, wherever he is, it's not clear, but they say Cambodia at one point, right? That music that is supposed to add a sense of meaning to this violence and to make it almost pleasurable, right? That we're watching a meaningful thing take place, even though we're just watching people get killed for no reason, right? Moves from within Alan's own footage to Deodato's, right, to the frame narrative again, and it takes place in that scene where they're watching it, where they're
To
playing
your
with the film.
living room.
Yeah, and I think that the kind of elevated tone of the music is being critical of Alan as trying to move his audience by showing this violence that he has staged, right, and it's applied to Deodato showing this violence that he has staged too, and that kind of cloying soundtrack spans both representations, both Alan Yates's and Ruggero Deodato's. I think that's kind of winkish, right? I think it's a way of the film. We've been talking about how it distances itself from Alan's narrative, right? Alan's narrative is staged, but the film is not. Well, the film really is, right? But the soundtrack is a way of uniting Alan's representations and Deodato's, and arguably the film is being self-critical in that moment. I feel like when I re-listen to this, that I'm giving the film a lot more credit than it perhaps has because I like it so much, because this is a very similar conversation I had after the first time I watched it. It's such an unresolvable film, and there's so much to say about it that it's a great intellectual experiment to talk about it and try to determine how self-aware it is, right? What are its morals with representation of sexual violence, right? Is it critical of its own uplifting message, right? And I think the soundtrack is what supports the yes, it is.
All right, so the question that I'm really interested in, and that I think that listeners might be interested in hearing us talk about, is how to locate Cannibal Holocaust on the shelf, right? Where do we see it located? We are obviously a horror podcast, so we do think that it belongs somewhere in the horror canon, but where is maybe an interesting question. So we're going to be, in this segment, thinking about it as a found footage film, but then also trying to trace it to other kinds of shelves where it maybe is influencing other films, or we see at least kind of connection or parallels to other kinds of films, and other camps within horror. So Andrew has already been introducing the connections he's seeing between this film and the slasher, and we'll say more about that, maybe put it in touch with some particular slasher films. I have suggested off air here that it is also seems to be in touch with torture porn, which we're going to take exception to that term, but we will maybe be putting in touch with things like Saw and Hostel. And then also thinking about it in relation to found footage, right? So we'll start with that area, right? Those kinds of traditional camps in the horror genre, and then we'll maybe move on to other shelves, other places where we can locate this film. So what do you guys think? Where do we locate this film? Where do we trace its influences? What kind of genre is Cannibal Holocaust?
Well, I'll start, and if it's okay with you guys, I'll actually start by kind of giving some background on how I got introduced to the film.
I think that's great.
Relevant.
Yeah.
So I saw this film when I was younger, when I was in my early 20s, and as I said on a previous episode, honestly, knowing what I know about it, if I were introduced to it today, I might not watch it. But when I was in my early 20s...
You just watched it today.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've already seen it,
What does that say about me? I'm in my 30s, and I knew what I was getting into, and I still watched it. Yeah.
Sounds like you have bad friends.
That's right. Yeah, you guys.
Well, I mean, I don't know. Maybe I would. I'm saying that without the benefit of hindsight.
Sure.
But, so when I was in my early 20s, I was becoming kind of a big horror fan, more conscious about my interest in that versus earlier where it was kind of like more of a thing I just enjoyed and didn't think about. And I was like looking for what is the most extreme thing I can watch. You know, what is the most disturbing movie I can see? Where, you know, can I see something that like most other people would not be comfortable with watching, right? And so I was looking for that, and I happened, of all places, at an academic conference, was introduced to this film. It was a Pennsylvania College English Association conference that I was like reading poetry or something at, and I was going to other panels. And someone was giving a paper on this film, and I had never heard of it, and I was like, whoa, this is whacked out, this is messed up, I've never heard of anything that is like this out there, and I had to track it down, and so I went up to the speaker afterwards and was like, hey, you know, I know you talked about this being such a controversial film, but how would I get a hold of it? He was like, this was in the early 2000s, so it wasn't that long ago, but it was still, I guess at that point, it was still kind of controversial, and he didn't want to tell me where he got it from, and he just told me, you know, oh, if you do an internet search, you'll find it, and so I did, found a place to get it from. And so thinking about that, I think that, you know, we've talked about it kind of in relation to found footage, but I think it also takes part in that tradition, like I was talking about, of, you know, Mondo films, of Herschel Gordon Lewis, the like extreme, like it's a certain level of extremity, which is I think why you brought up torture porn, right? It's pushing the boundaries. That's what it's setting out to do. Is it's setting out to shock us rather than just scare us. It wants to disgust us. It wants to make us disturbed and disgusted and uncomfortable. It wants us to vomit like the characters in the film we were vomiting. So I kind of put it in that tradition of, you know, even something like the David Cronenberg films of body horror, right? Mm-hmm. That are trying to show us images that not just scare us but disgust us. And so in relation to then the films that have followed from that, not just films that are in the found footage like Blair Witch, but also, as you said, Josh, you know, Saw, Hostel, and then there have been a lot of French films too that fall within this. There's the French extremity movement of the mid to late 2000s, films like High Tension, and Them, and Inside, and Irreversible fall into this extreme depictions of mutilation and rape and just bodily disturbing images. So I would kind of put this on that shelf, like things that that are categorized by being reliant on sort of a sensationalistic depiction of violence, what I would call sort of a Grand Guignol type of thing, you know, the Grand Guignol plays that were all about like these realistic depictions of violence that were happening in the late 19th and early 20th century, that had nothing like that had been done before, you know, of trying to push the boundaries of what can we actually accept as being something fictional entertainment.
Yeah. Well, I have a follow-up question for you. It just based on your really interesting kind of origin story of where you first heard of the film, and the guy at the academic conference kind of ironically giving a talk on the film and then being resistant to telling you how to access the film, right?
Yeah.
That makes me just want to raise the question to you, Andrew. Do you feel like it's a film that belongs not just on the kind of shock horror shelf, but on the shelf at the mom and pop video store that is behind the beaded curtain door, the not so secret door that, you know, you see the kind of skeevy guy going in and out of to rent the pornography, right? Yeah. Is it that shelf that it needs to be on, like the horror shelf that's inside that room, or would you put it in is it tame enough for you to be comfortable putting it on the shelf next to Hostel or next to Saw, right?
No.
Okay.
No, because I feel like if you watch this film and you watch Hostel or Saw back to back, you'd be like, oh man, Hostel was weak.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, as much as those kind of films get called torture porn, this.
It's so they're so much more mediated, right? That it's so much more obvious, even in their very graphic depictions in Saw, in the Saw franchise, the Hostel franchise, I guess, that it's a movie, right? And in this case, my first encounter is tonight watching this film, right? And even though to me, I'm a little still unclear as to how viewers, even in 1980, would have felt like the depictions of violence against people would have been like legitimate depictions, like that they needed to, make sure that the actors were okay, right? To me, that seems a little mythological or difficult to believe, and yet. The claim of realism in this film, the tease of realism in this film, makes it, for me, something that I'd be that same academic, I think, that like is comfortable maybe writing a paper about it, hopefully not necessarily having to rewatch it to do my research to write the paper, right?
Well, I mean, he was showing clips of the film during his presentation too.
So I think that's really interesting to me. That kind of dynamic, right, of being a fan of the genre, being willing to talk about it in an academic circle, and then being hesitant to lead somebody down the path of locating it. And as you said earlier, I think he was hesitant. In part, you got the impression because it seemed like he was maybe concerned that it would somehow link back to him, that it's like the kind of film that you're not supposed to have access to.
Right, exactly, because I don't know that the film at that point had a legitimate, like, USA distribution.
Sure.
So it was like a film. I mean, ironically, as opposed to other countries like the UK, the US has not been as puritanical about policing films as some other countries have, like the UK or Germany. But I don't know that at this point, I mean, this is why we had so much trouble figuring out how to watch the film, because it's all in Italian, right? I think it's a DVD, even though it's, I guess, a Region 1 DVD, but it's all like designed for Italian audiences. Sure. All the menus and stuff are in Italian. We couldn't tell which version of it to put on, and he was like, I think he was nervous about like revealing some kind of bootleg company, even though this is, as far as I can tell, a legitimate release, like some company that was like illegal or something,
Sure.
So I mean, that mythos has been going on since it was released up till the early 2000s.
I mean, I think that's my understanding of the way that we should all be introduced to this movie, is with that disclaimer, with that warning, with the trouble of having to track it down, and almost needing to do a little bit of the legwork in order to even just kind of get your hands on it, get your eyes on it. Because it's one that once you watch it, I think it's kind of hard to get out of your mind. Some of the scenes are just kind of now they're kind of in me, and I don't know how I feel about you two for introducing it to me as a result of that.
Well, that's a
let me just say that it was my birthday a couple days ago, and they asked
Happy
me
birthday, friend. Yeah.
They asked me what I wanted to do for it, and I said, "Oh, well, let me pick the next film that we talk about in the podcast."
That's right.
And I chose this one.
That's right.
I just want to throw another influence out there, because we've been talking about the question of the representation of indigeneity, right? Mm-hmm. Another influence we haven't actually talked about, though, is the representation of these sort of rural people of being violent, not just indigenous people, but films like Deliverance,
Sure.
for example.
Sure.
Taking part in that, right? I mean, I feel like that has become a part of cinema that is played obviously significantly to the horror genre, but not only horror. I mean, I think that is the thing that runs throughout all of cinema history, particularly in the 70s, that became with films like Deliverance or The Hills Have Eyes, right? You have the rural people versus the city people.
Well, Josh was talking about this. He's like being critical of the film, right? As earlier in the podcast, is like, oh, why not choose aliens then, right? Which I thought was a good point. But he also compared it to Dances with Wolves, right?
Dances with Wolves. Let me just jump to Dances with Wolves here. So, yes, Cannibal Holocaust is a found footage film. It ends with the decision to burn the film, but of course it's not burned because we are watching it, right? So that makes it unlike a later found footage film, The Ring, in which the way you stay alive is to reproduce the tape instead of destroying it, right? So that's kind of interesting, right? It inspires that found footage genre, but then people take liberties and do different things with that genre, right?
It also probably, I think it pays more attention to the frame than other found footage films.
Sure.
Right? It makes use of the frame.
Yeah.
In fact, without the frame, it makes no sense at all, right? And I think when we talk about, because we've talked a lot about Deodato's take on his own film, right? The frame is the thing that hinges upon.
Yeah.
And so it's I think it's the most important part of the film.
Definitely.
There's a lot of, so it's important to know that when we talk about its influence on other found footage films, right? Cannibal Holocaust is, what it does is it returns periodically to the frame for effect, whereas a found footage film like The Blair Witch Project merely, and you guys can defend this film if you want, merely uses the idea of a frame kind of quickly to add a level of realism to the film.
The Blair Witch Project has the tease that we've just found this footage and popped it in.
That's
so
right.
it's like we found this footage and there's intertexts that tell us that this footage was found, such and such thing, right? And then it's put in for us, right? And we press play, right? And so it's not about interrogating the what happens on the screen, but about being able to like put us through it, witness what happens.
Whereas Cannibal Holocaust makes use of reel changes, right? You change, I have to switch the reel to actually cut between scenes, right? It uses the frame not only thematically, but functionally in the way that it's filming.
Yeah, so
right?
I mean, so does Blair Witch Project, in that it uses the like end of tape to cut. They run out of tape and then they have to restart, and it does that to kind of jar.
But you begin again within the story, right?
Right. Yeah, it's not using to cut out of the story into the frame.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
Because there's little to no frame.
Right, and I mean, in Cannibal Holocaust, one of the things that I noticed that I hadn't really thought about before is the moments where in the frame they're actually talking about editing film, right?
That's
They're
right.
talking, they're saying, oh, he has a diaphragm or something over the lens.
Yeah, that's right.
He's doing it wrong. Oh, no,
Yeah,
there he goes. He's doing it right.
Yeah.
Or that, the moments where they actually don't have the mic turned on, even though the mic is like attached to the camera.
Yes.
Oh, I added some stock music in, which I guess is supposed to be like the jungle birds and sounds of the jungle, that are added in by these people who want to play this on TV.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. So there's a lot about the manipulation of film. In fact, that's like almost entirely. You almost can't make an entirely argument about Cannibal Holocaust, but at the heart of Cannibal Holocaust is a consideration of the way that film can manipulate and the way that editing, that kind of tedious work of structuring the story, it's not just documentary in particular is not just straight story of chronology, it's discourse. It's an arranged story.
Right, because within the story, right, they're working on turning this into a TV documentary.
That's
right.
right.
So there's a a need to tailor the film, right, to edit it, to splice it, that we don't see in many other found footage.
Okay, and
where it's a commodity. The film is a commodity, right? It's waiting to be one.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question? Because something we brought up before, where, for example, when we talked about something like Silence of the Lambs or movies with human killers, right, is the question of realism. And that becomes an important question in this film and how we read its politics or how we read its effect on viewers. I am someone who tends to be more critical of realism. I think realism is a manipulative way to get us to accept a reality that is an illusion. And so I guess one of the reasons why I'm interested in this film is because I think a lot of what we've been talking about hinges on the fact that on the one hand it is doing that, it's like it's showing us that this is an illusion while also exploiting the idea of it being realistic, right? Which is why Deodato has to go to trial, because obviously I don't think people thought that the scenes in New York or whatever with Professor Monroe were real, but they thought that maybe some of the scenes, of people in the Amazon getting killed were real. And the animal killings are real. And so I'm just curious on what your take on realism is, like what function narratively realism has in horror and as us as like movie viewers, and how this film uses that, and whether it's kind of is it so exploitative because it's trying to get away from the realism while also using the realism as a way of like exploiting our ideas about indigeneity or sexual violence or whatever, while also like trying to say, using the excuse of it being an illusion.
Here's where I can talk about Dances with Wolves, right?
Good.
And so I'm going to actually start by talking about Dances with Wolves by talking about Edward Curtis. Are you guys familiar with Edward Curtis, the photographer?
No.
Okay, so he's like a really famous 19th century, at least a Western photographer, and in circles that are concerned with thinking about Native history, right? Edward Curtis is really important because he's kind of the premier 19th century photographer that goes on a quest very similar to Lieutenant Dunbar in Dances with Wolves to go and document the disappearing, vanishing race of Native peoples. Right? Of course, they're not vanishing. Of course, that's his politics shining through. Right, the narrative that he's bringing with him with his camera to the West to document Native peoples. But along with the camera, he's bringing suitcases of luggage full of props for the Native people to wear what he considers Native-looking garb so that they can look more authentically Native in the photographs that he's taking of them, right? And this becomes an issue when it's Edward Curtis's photos that still often populate and dominate the history textbooks that high schoolers get, right? So first of all, when we think of Native people, we often think of them as like the stuck in the formaldehyde of the past, right? Being museum objects, being located in the past. So we immediately go to the history textbook, not to the Stephen Graham Jones's brand new Mongrels werewolf novel, right? Native writer writing today, continuing to work, right? We first think of Native peoples as being located in the past. And Edward Curtis is really responsible in many ways for the image, the literal image that we have of what the Native person in the past looks like, because he's not only documenting through the camera, but he is putting on the costume of what he imagines Native peoples are supposed to look like. So he's supremely important for the misrepresentations of Native peoples in history, and simultaneously for continuing to cement Native people's place as being in history, because his entire project is built on the premise that we have to document this vanishing race, right? Now that gets us to Dances with Wolves. And it actually, so unlike Cannibal Holocaust, Dances with Wolves is not making super overt claims to realism in the same way. It's not using like found footage to try to make us feel more authentically in the space, right? It's using over-the-top soundtrack to really make us, to manipulate the way we're engaging with the film, to feel the romance of the frontier, right? So there's many ways in which it is a romance plot. This is a long way of saying that one of the things that I see happening in Cannibal Holocaust, in it, how it's trying to negotiate its representation of Native peoples and the encounter narrative that I've suggested is sort of like an alien encounter narrative in Cannibal Holocaust. But this is the kind of problem, I guess, that I'm suggesting, is that so often the frontier narrative becomes a way of justifying a representation in which the Native people are really secondary to just telling the story of whatever the narrative, whether it be romantic or horrific or whatever the case may be. The encounter is all that really matters, and then the indigenous people become background noise, a threat of violence, but not fully formed, fleshed, real characters, right? They might as well be zombies, they might as well be aliens, they don't have to be indigenous, right? There's nothing, we don't learn like hardly anything about them other than that they're really violent, that we can't communicate with them, right? And I would say that, just to wrap this up, there's a way in which Professor Monroe in the frame narrative is very much aligned with Lieutenant Dunbar, and the depiction of Lieutenant Dunbar in Dances with Wolves as a kind of guy who knows Indians, right? A guy who can travel into the places and know how to converse and even become Native and then leave. He gets to survive and leave and tell that story, or in Professor Monroe's case, burn that story, right? So Lieutenant Dunbar preserves the story in his journals so that the disappearance of the frontier can be lamented and romanticized after the tragic ending of the Lakota people, as the film suggests. Of course, they're not dead. They just defeated a multinational corporation, right? Just like a couple days ago. And yet, I guess those are the kinds of connections I'm trying to draw.
Let me ask you a question then. Because Dances with Wolves and Cannibal Holocaust have very different messages about the people who we make contact with in that Jacksonian friction point, right?
No.
And I'm going to return to Heart of Darkness here for a second. Right? Many people are critical. Chinua Achebe was very critical of Conrad in his representation of the Native people of the Congo, because they don't get a voice at all. Right? They're kind of represented in the background and reduced to their body. And I think you can make the same claim about what's going on in Cannibal Holocaust, right? My response to that has been, well, just like with Dances with Wolves, when Conrad's writing, he's responding to this adventure romance genre, a very popular way of writing novels, in which a British hero goes to a kind of unknown or foreign territory and winds up becoming the savior.
Mm-hmm.
And when the native peoples get a voice, right, it's always a voice that sends back the message that we were looking for in the novel, which is, you are great, thank you for saving us, you are a just and civilized person, and whatnot. Right? So people have made fun of, or critiqued Conrad for not representing a voice for the inhabitants of the Congo, but whenever they do get a voice, right, it's that confirming one.
Mm.
So there's a certain level of honesty in that silence, right? And to bring that to Cannibal Holocaust, right? Because in Dances with Wolves, right, there is that self-satisfying voice of the Native American population, right, that really likes Lieutenant Dunbar and is affirming. But in Cannibal Holocaust, right, we don't get the perspective of the so-called cannibals at all.
Right.
And I'm wondering how you guys read the film in making that move. Like, would you prefer it if those two tribes got a voice, or is there something redeeming about them not getting one at all? Right?
Yeah, I think that it. I mean, it's so obvious. It hopefully should go without saying that, like, they are totally different films, right? The Dances with Wolves and Cannibal Holocaust. But I do take your point. I think that's an actually really interesting
I kind of like
question.
I like the more pessimistic take on that.
Yeah. So I won't belabor this point, but in Dances with Wolves, the romance surrounding the tragic vanishing of the frontier is really its violence, right? It doesn't perceive itself as that. It thinks that it's doing, like, Kevin Costner and the production team think that they're doing justice to the story of the plains and the history, right? But in almost any way of reading that film, it does have very beautiful moments. There's really compelling things that happen in it, but almost any way of reading it is one of really reinforcing this idea that a good white guy can tell the story of what happened on the plains, and we get to identify with them, even though the film reverses who are the villains, right? And we make the native characters sympathetic, which is important, but we do so and still, so, yeah, go ahead, you had something.
Yeah, I think, like, the good white guy,
Yeah.
right, in Cannibal Holocaust is Professor Monroe, right?
Right, kind of.
Kind of. Well, maybe from the film's perspective it is him, right? But I honestly think he is a walking cliche.
Sure.
That guy.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether that's a fault, like the film is aware of that or not, whether that's just a kind of one-dimensional, kind of boring character, or if the film wants to show us a walking cliche.
Yeah.
Right? And if it does do that, then I'm way more interested in it as a piece of art.
Yeah, so that's the kind of overcomplicated connection that I was trying to make, is that Professor Monroe makes a nice comparison, and in some ways I think an intervention in the kind of Costner tragic romance version of a similar, honestly in some ways a very similar kind of plot, just a very different tone, very different approach, very different sense of moral stance and how to speak on behalf, right? So I think that one thing that I appreciate about Cannibal Holocaust, whether or not it is intentional, is that Professor Monroe isn't a, like, totally redeeming white savior, right? That he too is lacking lots of knowledge, he's not separate, and I don't think the film takes efforts really to totally separate him from Alan's film, right? He's disgusted by Alan's film, but he was participating in something that wasn't all that different from Alan's film, right? And so that part is really interesting. And then the other question that you raise about, like, thinking about Cannibal Holocaust, and is it, like, maybe a more honest depiction, just because it doesn't attempt to show like communication happening. I don't know how to answer
It has
that.
to burn the fucking reality of that.
You have to burn the reality of the contact.
Well, and here's my thought on it, because early on when you see Professor Monroe going in, he wants to intervene, right? He wants to stop the ritual killing, right? Yeah. He is afraid because he doesn't know what has happened, right? His kind of perspective changes as the film goes on, right? And I think, for me anyway, I don't know if it's giving the film too much credit to say this, but my takeaway in it is not that we understand Native people in the Amazon in one way or another, whether positively, negatively, whatever. To me, the point is more like, maybe we shouldn't be there. Maybe white people should not be in this space, and that we can't trust any white person, whether it's Professor Monroe or Ellen or whoever. So what I was saying earlier about like it not being as much about like the indigenous people being scary is because it's like, it's not trying to comment on them and what they're doing. At least that's not my takeaway. My takeaway is what white people are doing by going into these spaces and like saying that is the scary thing, that we should not be doing that. Again, is that a too much of a like cop out or celebratory reading that is not justified? But I don't know. That's kind of my response to everything I've seen, rather versus something like Dances with Wolves that is like, okay, if you can become enough like the indigenous people, or you can understand them enough, you can be more respectful toward them. Yeah. You can have this.
But part of the film though is that there is a way to honestly interact with tribes in the Amazon as a white person.
Well, like I don't think so. The Monroe's interactions are all about getting that footage back.
Well, that's
not
my second point. Yeah. But I was going to say that there does seem to be because there is something to be. There is a value in Monroe's interaction with them, and it's almost pastoral and celebratory and whatnot, right? But behind that is he's hired by the History Channel essentially to make profits,
and also on top of that, the exchange that he has to go through in order to get back the footage is to eat another person, is to be a cannibal,
yes.
Which is another, like, that's what my point is, like, so like the point about not feeling like the film is making making a commentary on Native monstrosity or not, and instead is like, I totally take that point. It's making us think about white monstrosity of the imperial march towards new landscapes and the attempts to find new contact zones, right? But it's disturbing for me that it's also not that the sense that you're getting is that it's not making a commentary on your understanding of indigeneity, because it's also reinforcing this idea.
In fact, it's playing with it's telling actual tribes, Deodato worked with actual tribes to act in a way that they're not
the Edward
cannibals.
Curtis thing.
They're not cannibals, exactly. Curtis is this equivalent of Curtis taking out the prop and giving it to the native character. Right? In order to tell that base story, even if you make the claim it's not about Native people, he's saying, okay, now here's this fake human hand, and I want you to gnaw on it. Because those are
just
our expectations.
Like Romero has the ghouls that later get recognized as zombies, like gnaw on the body parts in Night of the Living Dead, right? Like it reminds me of that kind of cannibalism, I guess, that we're getting. And that's my point, is that like I'm not trying to police our view. I mean, it probably sounds like I am. I'm not so much trying to police our viewing of this and like having the equal but opposite problematic representation of the noble savage, the Fern Gully narrative, right? Like of Native peoples as being docile and innocent and having no problem. Like that's, I'm not trying to get a one or the other here, right? But what I'm suggesting is that it's kind of a problem of the film that we can watch it and not think that there's any commentary happening about indigeneity.
We can't because the implied reader of this film, the implied viewer, is a Western viewer, right? And the fact of the director's Italian nationality and of the film's frame in New York is that. And anytime you structure a film that is edited from the perspective of a Western filmmaker, there's got to be something. There's going to be a representation of a native tribe or whatever that matters, that says something about the perspective even more so than it does about the representation of Native people, and that's unavoidable. Mm-hmm. But one thing about Cannibal Holocaust that I like is that it, at least, unlike Dances with Wolves, at least it interrogates that perspectivity.
At
the very, even though it's doing things that are like kind of upend its own message, at the very least, it's forefronting. It's using the frame to forefront that perspective.
Yeah, no, I think that this is the cleanest way I can say it, that at least it has the decency to not romanticize that encounter and that really ugly, violent history in the way that Dances with Wolves does, right? Dances with Wolves, to me, does a kind of other kind of violence that's harder to undo because it's trying to be so sympathetic, but ultimately is making you... reinforcing all of the same kinds of tropes that have already been, problems.
Well, it's exculpating the viewer who's a part of the fucking, right, whether they want to be or not, a part of the displacement of native lands in America, right? It's positing this sympathetic connection that can span Dunbar to the multi-million viewing audience.
But I do think that you guys are both picking up on really cool... and important ways of thinking about Cannibal Holocaust, in that it is really making interventions, and pretty daring, bold interventions, I think, in the way we think about that contact narrative, right? That's maybe like the easiest way to come back and say that, because it is complicated, and it's kind of, for me, like a difficult film to work my way through, especially this soon after watching it. I almost need to like sit down and think about it and work my way through the connections I'm seeing. But, its use of the documentary form and the manipulations of how that is recording the history is more honest and interesting than, to me, as a viewer, even, like, I can't explain away the graphic sexual violence, the graphic violence against animals, there's lots and lots and lots of loads of problems with the film, right? There's no way of reconciling these things. Yeah. But I think that representation of the violence of how history gets told and the manipulative ways in which it gets told is making a critique into the kind of the textbook photographs that we see from Edward Curtis, or the romanticized...
I think maybe the last thing that I will say, and this is a pretty huge general argument about this film comes out in the 1980s, and Josh, you were a little skeptical about the idea that people would believe that this was actually happening, right?
Yeah.
Right, but it comes out in 1980, right, before... You could say before the postmodern moment, right? Before post-structuralism, right?
Way before YouTube, when we were seeing images.
So I don't know. The fact that people believe this was real and that Deodato structured that is kind of contradicts, or it has a kind of productive tension with the message of the film that nothing is real, like that everything that we're seeing is perspectival and comes to us in a structured way. And that the divisions that we draw between us and them are in fact created by us, right? Mm-hmm. And I don't know, maybe the film is kind of ahead of its time, and has a lesson that would follow in its wake, with the way that, like, I don't know, English studies in our field, or is the academy, like, has moved in that direction.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I would consider kind of a postmodern film, and in the same way that Scream does, right? That Scream interrogates the conventions. It interrogates the fact that the virgin always survives, right? Mm-hmm. Things like that, where in the same way this film is doing that, like I said, with the sort of Mondo films that came before it, right? It's sort of, again, I don't want to say it's interrogating them in the way that it's like saying, because it's not mentioning those type of films. Well, I mean, I guess it is, because it is referring to basically what Alan's documentaries are basically Mondo films, right? Mm-hmm. So I don't know. I guess I keep going back and forth on this point, but the thing that I think of too is that it's dealing with such a problematic concept in so many problematic ways. Mm-hmm. That, like I said, it's almost kind of like saying, well, white people shouldn't even be here. So then that raises the question, well, should then we not even make a film like this? Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? And that kind of goes into the question of, like, we were talking about the influence, right, of films like torture porn. Yeah. Which I just want to say, the reason I rejected that label is actually based on my reading of an article by Adam... I can't remember his actual last name. I think it was Wittenstein or something like that. Andrew here. I actually butchered this film critic's name. His name is Adam Lowenstein, Lowenstein. And the article in question is Spectacle Horror in Hostel, Why Torture Porn Does Not Exist. But he wrote an article called Why Torture Porn Is Not Real, or something like that, where he breaks down Hostel and he looks at the reasons why people have criticized it and calling it torture porn, and saying all it's doing is indulging and reveling in showing the torture of people, that it's just a purely sadistic thing, much like Siskel and Ebert were saying about slashers. I think that's why I had slashers on my mind earlier, because the same kind of thing has been leveled at films like this. But that his argument is actually that Hostel is doing many other kinds of things besides just indulging in torture. Mm. So I would say that about Cannibal Holocaust. I guess that's why I would say, although I think I agree with everything you're saying, Josh, on the reasons why I would find it problematic, uncomfortable, is that although it is indulging in this in torture, I would not want to hedge around that. It is indulging in that. At the same time, it's doing much more than that at the same time.
Yeah, no, I think so. I mean, I guess the point that I want to make is not that I reject the film or deny it, any of it, the very credible points that you guys have made based on its representation of Native peoples, because of course there's an entire shelf or library of films that we can look at in a whole different podcast that are like misrepresentations of Native peoples, right? And that's that's not even so much the issue. It's to me, when I'm focusing on its representations here, I'm just concerned, I guess, that we are more able to tell how the film is making commentaries on how we tell history than we are on whether or not it's commenting on real or made-up rituals for Native people in the Amazon, or real or actual or imagined. I guess that's the thing that's trouble, is that it doesn't work equally, there's an imbalance in how it's blurring of lines between reality and fiction happens depending on the characters we're thinking about, right? If it's kind of the background indigenous characters, the primary audience, Western viewers, are likely to just automatically feel like, no, this makes sense because they're savage. You know? This just makes sense because this is how it is, right? And it can, and if it's doing that just to be able to make the commentary on should white people just as savage, right? Then that to me is it's a weird false equivalent that's hard to unpack because I just reject the kind of premise is my point, right? Yeah. Like to get all the way to the end to a final line of who's the more savage. Well, like you've started from a premise of believing that this group is savage, and you've reinforced that, and that's been built largely by Western films. And it's not my work to try to reject or not watch things that have bad representations, because I think that's just like a self-defeating purpose. Like I'm interested in the problems, and I want to watch the things with the problems in them. But I think that in some ways it overcomplicates a really simple problem, which is that at the premise of the film is this misunderstanding of indigeneity meaning primitive and savage.
Right, and I guess I'll just say, and I guess I've probably been making this point about a lot already, but it's because it's the most interesting thing for me about the film, is that does the film take that premise, seriously, or does it represent it as a flimsy excuse to represent violence and kind of get away with it? In other words, does the film feel like it redeems itself because ultimately it's telling that message, which is problematic and flawed and isn't indulging in a tradition of the native contact zone as a place to see violence, but it's ultimately justified because it's ultimately an empathetic narrative where they're like us, so we make all these kind of problematic distinctions between us and them, whatever. And is it putting forth that message, or is it kind of saying to the viewer and saying about itself that this film goes so far that the very idea that that representing this violence serves that narrative that where the Western society is savage too, is kind of a flimsy one that only functions as an entryway into violence and only functions for that pleasurable and upsetting viewing experience that is ultimately pleasurable for the Western viewer, right? How strong is that as the film? How much does the film believe in its own moral, or is its own moral merely a way to exploit, right? And that the film is aware of that. I don't know. Probably not. I'll say this again. I give this film way more credit than I do because I want it. I want Ruggero Deodato to be like a genius.
Yeah.
I don't know if he is,
but I mean, I think it's both because, I honestly, I think I see it more as the latter. But
what is the latter? Remind
of you saying like it's using I don't think you can argue that it's coming down on a strong moral stance. For example, something we have not talked about is the animal violence. We've not talked about that much, right? Why did he actually kill animals to make the film? Because he was trying to get that gritty realism, right? Because he did not think there was a moral problem in doing that, in killing animals, and that is part of what makes the film so sensationalistic, so realistic, is showing the blood and gore, not just of rape, not just of indigenous people or white people getting killed, but showing animals get dissected. I mean, that turtle scene is truly one of the most horrific scenes in all of cinema for myself, being an animal lover. Because you see it, it's not just, and you see it still moving as it's getting ripped apart, as it's
That's right.
getting amputated, its insides coming out. And so I think Deodato is making this thinking like that he's going to make you uncomfortable, and you can see that as a kind of moral stance, but at the same time, like, I don't think the film seems to be saying, like, if you think that too much is gonna you're gonna stop because it's too much, you're being dishonest, because we all love to see this, right?
Yeah.
Nothing is too much to make entertaining, enjoyable art, which is Alan's point of view, right?
That's
like,
right. That is exactly. As you were speaking, I was thinking to myself that the turtle scene is probably the best example of the shrinking of the distance between Alan and the makers of Cannibal Holocaust. Right, and throughout the film, they seem to be wanting to differentiate or to distance themselves from Alan's perspective. But when it comes down to the animal violence, which Alan is performing, and that is so real, and that is the end of sentient life,
and he's
right?
saying
that has to be reflective.
Right.
That's a moment where it has to be reflective of the filmmakers. It goes right back to the filmmakers as the puppet masters in this game.
And he's
and
saying, "Are you getting this on
moral
film?"
is
As
flimsy.
when they start to
doesn't-
get that,
Yeah, that makes me think that the film is like kind of aware of this kind of simplicity of its moral frame.
It is.
Because
I
it's
think it is
indulging in
aware.
it.
It's not.
You know?
Again, I think I've tried to say this, but I think it's not trying to make any kind of strong or profound moral statement. It's just at the same time, like, it's kind of aware of what it's doing.
Right.
Which is what you find, Josh.
Yeah, that's
is
what I'm
you
saying.
find frustrating.
Yeah, is it like to say you're aware of what you're doing and I'm not making a strong moral statement is like that. It, to me, is a really dangerous combination. Like to have sentience about the morality of what you're doing, and then to sort of throw your hands up or not throw your hands up, but just like kind of shrink back and say, I'm just kind of putting it on screen, and it almost makes. I don't even know what to make of that. That's a hard. That's a hard.
Nihilistic or something.
Yeah, it's like really. It's very disturbing. Which I mean, I'll grant it. That's probably intentional, right? It has to be intentional. I don't want to be in the theater with the group of filmgoers that are just sitting back casually watching this, right? I mean, it does make you think about things like, I know Andrew is a vegetarian, right? But like seeing the turtle getting torn apart can't help but make you think, well, I eat meat too, right? Like, but it's more than just like killing it for sustenance, right? It's killing it like for entertainment,
art, right?
And it's horribly disturbing, right? It's like really, it's truly horrifying, but in ways that I don't want my horror to be horrifying.
Honestly, it makes me hate Ruggero Deodato.
I hate it, man.
Yeah.
Like that, like, I hated watching that scene, right?
Yeah.
As I hated watching many of the scenes. And yet I've thoroughly enjoyed the conversation, other than the parts where I'm stammering and not making any sense. But I've thoroughly enjoyed talking about this because I do think it blurs like the incredibly oversimple with really complex motivations and conversation, right? And that tease is so frustrating.
I know.
It's hard.
Aren't you happy you saw it? This is an awesome movie, man. Like, it lends itself to such really complex dilemmas about what the fuck they were thinking of making. It was probably an accidental just wang jangle that they put on screen.
Yeah.
But like, it's such a provocative film, you know, and not just because like the easy way to talk about Cannibal Holocaust that you'll hear in other inferior podcasts is just, whoa, and all that. So it's so gruesome. Whoa, animal cruelty. Whoa, there's a trial. Whoa, it's like, sure, you know, of course it's supposed to be provocative and lurid and sensationalist, but Really, the question is the morals of the film, right? Placing it in this tradition. I think you're talking about Dances with Wolves, and what the fuck are like? How much do the directors believe in the fact that there is a moral to this at all? I think is the most interesting question about the film.
And what I was trying to say earlier about the way that I see it, despite the fact that it's going to such extreme lengths and being so casual about the way it's both using real violence and even in its staging of violence is also being exploitative, like it's so casual about that, it's doing something different than either the camps when we were talking about like the relation between morality and horror, right? It's doing something different than just the camp that celebrates and defends it, or the camp that just dismisses it as being like purely sadistic and evil, or the camp that is just saying it's just entertainment. Like, I don't think it fits into either of those things. And I kind of feel like a lot of films today don't reckon with that. I would not want to see someone try to do something like Cannibal Holocaust today for many reasons, for its representation of indigenous people, for its use of animal cruelty. On the other hand, I've seen many movies that have come out in the last few years that I feel like are just not going very deep. They're not kind of troubling me as a viewer in a way that it feels more manipulative than Cannibal Holocaust does, because I feel like that is going to an extreme and being unabashed about what it's doing, whereas in films of today where it kind of like, you know, tries to throw some jump scares at you and Lights Out is a film, I won't reveal the ending, but it has kind of a shocking ending to it, and I don't like it. I don't like what it does because of the way it plays upon mental illness and things like that. But, you know, those kind of moves where a film is like trying to shock you, but at the same time trying to distance you as a viewer from it in a way that I don't think this film does. Yeah. So while I would not say I would not want a film today to do what Cannibal Holocaust does, I do wish that there were, you know, filmmakers who were more willing to sort of explore their own role in sort of the perpetuation of violence and being like making viewers uncomfortable rather than just titillating them.
Yeah, I mean, here you're kind of already gesturing to the last question I had, but that's related. But like, do you guys burn the film, or what do you do with it now? Like, you know, this is the last question, right? Yeah. So like, do we burn the film at the end, like they suggest that they're going to do before they release it to us, right? Do you recommend this to anyone outside of this room or on the podcast? I'll just go out and answer my own question very simply and say, like, I can't imagine ever watching this again or ever recommending that someone else watch it. And part of me wants to say shame on you, Josh, for saying that, because it's inspired such good conversation. And who do you think you are for, are you such a sophisticated viewer that you can watch it, but you can't tell anyone else to, yeah. Right? You start to get into that worry, right? But so many of the scenes, to me, I could never watch again. I just couldn't watch it again.
You'd be surprised. Let a couple months go by. You know, I think, okay, so to respond to your two questions, do you burn the film?
Yeah, do you burn it? Or what do you do with it? And then
personally, would you share it with someone?
So I say I don't burn the film, because I will still say that, like, what I'm battling with is my, like, deep feelings of this, not just depicting and representing violence, but, like, actually performing violence in like, narratively, but also, like, depicted on screen. But I'll still, so the war I'm having is between my deep feelings that there's so many things in the movie that I don't want to see and I don't think we should watch and look at, and my defense of like creative arts and being able to do things creatively, right? So I'll say that those end in a tie in this case, which is rarely ever happens. that it gets to that point, right? So I say I don't burn it. If you want to watch it, do, but know that when you watch it, it is gonna have things that like should should upset you. Like, I'm kind of worried about the world we're in right now, that maybe people there's a part of the population that can watch that and like find it entertaining.
Well, you know, the NRA funded it.
No. Come on.
But I would say, if I could go back in time and it's 1979, whenever they're filming this thing, right? Do I tell Deodato to fucking change his mind about some things? Yeah, of course I do. You know, would I show a friend? I would show a very close friend who would think of it as a provocative movie that would allow us to have a good conversation, just like we did with you tonight.
Yeah.
Like, do I burn the film? No way. I'm not going to be the person to introduce it to some people, but I don't know. Maybe some people have to watch it, you know, and watch it knowing that they burn it in the film. I don't know. There's some... Sure, the morals of Cannibal Holocaust are very flawed and very complicated, right? But show me another film that burns itself in the film. Like, there's a certain novelty to that, and it provokes thought, you know? Like, I don't know. I burn it in the same way that the film burns it, right? I say that it should be burnt, but I give it to you, right? You know what I mean? And I think that there's I don't know. The viewers at home can agree or disagree with that, but, you know, watch it if you want. Don't watch. I'd say if you're over, what's a good age to say? I'm sure we have a lot of youngsters in the audience here, maybe teens. Maybe if you're 16.
Unless you're over 50, don't watch this.
Yeah. And I'll say NC-17.
Yeah, I'm gonna go older. I'm gonna say, like, when's the age that male brains?
Like 25,
there you
27.
go, somewhere in there.
Like
Let's be safe. Let's be
I'm
safe.
sure 28. So. Yeah. I watched it at 27 though.
Yeah.
That's probably what I'm so fucked.
I mean, obviously, I don't say burn the film because I have the DVD and I introduced it to you, so I hope
you want to burn
not...
it. You want to burn it tonight? We're gonna go outside and burn Cannibal Holocaust.
We could, yeah. Movie burning. I mean, I hope you don't look down on me for having introduced you.
Well, let me just say, to wrap this up here, we were out smoking a cigarette before, because we take little breaks during these podcasts just to gather our thoughts and to, you know, relax our minds for a second. And Andrew was telling me that, you know, we compared this film to Heart of Darkness. We were talking about Apocalypse Now, and he was mentioning that there's real animal violence in there. And a cow... right, a member of the cattle gets decapitated in the film. And,
nice, I see what you did
and Andrew
there.
was saying that, oh wow, like that was really disturbing to me. I will say that he's a big metalhead, and I'm looking across the table at him right now, and he's wearing a shirt that promotes a band called Cattle Decapitation.
Yes, but they are a vegan band who promotes, like, the idea that our abuse of animals is horrific, so it's playing upon that.
Oh, well, I guess that covers it.
But I mean, yeah, so just to, you know, defend myself, like, I mean, the only reason I would ever recommend anyone to watch this is kind of for the reason why I suggested it to you two. People who I know are sort of interested in the history of horror, interested in films that ask really provocative and problematic questions.
Sure.
So I would not recommend this to anyone for entertainment value. Is a casual film to watch. Something that only if you really are willing to kind of explore something that is deeply disturbing and ugly, and that you're kind of willing to think about it on a more critical level, that would be my only recommendation. So probably a lot of casual horror film viewers should not see this film.
And it's fine never to watch it.
Yeah, it's totally fine. It's not a must-see by any means. You're not missing... like, I will say, in its defense, I know I've been kind of the voice of criticism. I'm still very new to the feelings that it has produced in me, right? So I'm still trying to work through that a little bit. But I will say that it already has begun kind of coloring how I feel like that I'm going to be reading horror films and the depictions of violence
Exactly.
in new ways that I'm interested in, and then I'll be taking that violence more seriously as a result of this. And I guess I have to credit the film for doing that, right? That I mean, I felt like I already was taking that really seriously, but it's something that, like, in some amalgamation of its structure, of its narrative form, of its depictions of violence, it's and the problems that it leaves us with and doesn't resolve, I think it has forced me to reread and look differently at the violence that I see in other forms.
That's
huge.
Yeah.
I mean, it did the same thing for me.
Yeah,
After seeing this, I kind of thought more critically about my interest, and now I think that there are movies that I'm really not sure that I would watch, like Martyrs or a Serbian film. I think in a Serbian film, one of the ideas is that this guy gets involved with, unwittingly gets involved with, like, a snuff child pornography kind of operation. And even though it's obviously, it's all fake, it's still, I feel like, maybe something too disturbing that I don't want to watch. I don't need to expose myself to.
Yeah.
And after, I mentioned, I think, in our introductory podcast that, I had a debate with this feminist who was talking to me about slashers and saying, like, it encourages men to be violent toward women, and that I was trying to defend it and, argue with her. I think after watching Cannibal Holocaust, it kind of made me think somewhat differently about that question. Taking that issue of violence more seriously, perhaps, than I had before.
Yeah. And I'll just say, just to wrap this conversation up, that it's a very scary and troubling and depressing experience to start and finish Cannibal Holocaust, but that there is a nice release of the trauma in being able to talk about it afterwards.
Yeah.
And I feel like talking to you guys really has kind of gotten rid of that feeling in my gut that I didn't really like very much after watching the film. So thank you for that. And if you watch it, if you guys do wind up watching it, I would say kind of do it in the format that we have, right? Don't watch this alone. Watch it with people. Have a conversation about it afterwards. Re-listen to the podcast again if it helps you process it. It's not a good film to be with your own thoughts afterwards. So thank you so much for listening. This has been Spectral Splatter, from ghosts to gore and everything in between.
Special birthday edition.
A special birthday edition. It was my birthday wish to watch Cannibal Holocaust. So what does that say about me as a sadomasochistic son of a bitch? Yeah. Anyway, join us next time for the next episode of Spectral Splatter. It's been great.